Hi, my name is Alicia, and welcome to Mess to Masterpiece. Today's topic is sepsis. I didn't know much about it prior to last week, but although my world was dramatically impacted as I experienced sepsis, and so I just want to talk a little bit about what it is today and my experience with it. So what is sepsis? It's when you read the scientific definition, it says chemicals released in the bloodstream to fight infection, which trigger inflammation. This is a very fast process. Sometimes different infections and sicknesses can kind of build over time, but this is definitely not one of those. And it was definitely a super fast, immediate effect that I saw. I woke up last Monday morning and wasn't feeling great. I was really tired, but that's not necessarily uncommon for me. I have days that I just don't sleep well, and so when I have a day that I'm tired, and so I was just really sleeping and resting, and luckily for me, I have a lot of home health people that come in and out, and so when one of my members of my team showed up, she noticed that I looked awful, and she's like, okay, we need to check. And so she checked my vitals. And so that's one thing. This is so important to have. I know, especially if you have chronic illness, it is so important to have a thermometer to be able to check to see where you're at. And then also a blood pressure cuff. This is something that not necessarily just used in emergencies, but it's really helpful to have on hand, and so you know what your normal is. So when they were able to check me, we were able to say, oh yeah, like I'm always, much lower. So thankfully with being able to be proactive, my nurse was able to call right away. They called the ambulance, and I was quickly able to get medical care, and they were able to get a diagnosis and everything, and that prevented more damage of my organs, which can happen, and death can even happen with sepsis. So it's definitely not something to play around with at all. And for people like me with multiple different illnesses, but also with having a port, which I've talked about in another video, that it makes it even more concerning when we run fevers especially, and so it's really important that you seek medical help. Believe me, I hate the hospitals too, but I'm so thankful that I went when I did. We prevented a lot of problems. So what kind of symptoms in general can sepsis cause? And it can cause lots of different things. It's different for everybody, but it can cause difficulty breathing, and part of that is because of a fast heart rate. And so my heart was running like between 140 and 160 for several days, and obviously that's much higher than normal, and so that was causing my breathing to be a lot more laborsome. And I didn't really notice that. It was actually my nurse that pointed that out. But definitely something to be aware of. Also, it can cause mental confusion, so I just kind of was out of it, and that was why it was really important that I got to the hospital when I did. I also had a high fever. It was 103.5, and then it ended up going even higher. So it's definitely important that you get checked out for that. As well as having a low blood pressure. My blood pressure was super sky high when I first went into the ER, and then it bottomed out, and it was really low for several days. And so that fluctuation is dangerous as well. So make sure that, again, it's why it's important to get to the doctor. And so once they took me into the emergency room, and obviously the COVID tests now, they had to rule out that. But then they started to do what's called a blood culture. And so if you have a port or a PICC line, then they typically will draw off blood from that site and then somewhere else. And that way then they can see if there's any kind of bacteria growing in your port or in the line itself, and that can kind of help narrow down where the infection's coming from. So they did that for me, and they did what's called a blood culture, and then they also went and tried to asked me if I had been having any pain anywhere else, if there was, they did some ultrasounds to try to see if there was any kind of internal bleeding or any other problems, just to rule out and make sure. And then that way, then once it didn't take very long. When the culture started growing, my culture ended up showing that I had a bacterial infection inside of my port, and it was staph, which it was mild compared to what it could have been as far as the severity. So I was very, very thankful, but ended up having to spend, I went in Monday afternoon and was there through Saturday. So definitely a long week in the hospital, but thankfully able to get to feeling better. And they sent me home with a PICC line. So I'm not using the port is getting it's called an antibiotic lock therapy. And so that's what it's getting. I'm not really putting TPN or anything through it. It's just kind of soaking and trying to kill the bacteria that were in there. And so that's why I'm using my PICC line for medicines and my TPN this week and for a couple of weeks. And so we know that my lines are clear. So hopefully that helps explain sepsis a little bit better. And hopefully you won't get it. I pray that you don't get it. But now you kind of know what it was. And as always, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to message me or comment below. I would love to hear from you, hear your experience. I'll see you again.